What is happening in El Salvador? The president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, is today the most popular political figure on the continent. His approval reaches 90%, according to Gallup, and experts classify him as a world-class figure. According to official data published in January 2024, 2023 had the lowest number of homicides in the history of El Salvador, says the government, when 154 homicides were recorded, a rate of 2.4 per 100,000 inhabitants. The previous year, in 2022, 495 homicides were recorded, or 7.8 per 100,000 inhabitants. Official data shows a precipitous drop in the homicide rate, which went from 106.3 per 100,000 inhabitants in 2015 to 2.4 last year. In 1994, El Salvador reported 134.78 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, according to figures from the United Nations on Drugs and Crime. Data on homicides cannot be independently verified with other institutions because the government of El Salvador has declared them confidential, arguing that disclosing more details puts national security at risk. Crime was the main problem for Salvadorians at the end of 2019. A survey by the University Institute of Public Opinion showed that in December 2019, 70.4% of those surveyed say that crime was the big problem for Salvadorians. The figure in December 2023 dropped to 4.3%. The government attributes this reduction to its security plan and the emergency regime established in 2022. Since the beginning of the state of emergency, at least 75,000 people have been detained, according to official figures from January 2024. In mid-2022, up to 2% of the Salvadorian population over 18 years of age, about 100,000 people, were in prison, according to an Amnesty International assessment based on local media reports. The arbitrary arrests of more than 150 people a day, according to HRW, have caused alarm among human rights activists, who say the justification for some arrests is insufficient. In this video, we're going to analyze what actions the current government took. But first, let's review what was happening in El Salvador before Nayib Bukele came to power. So, let's get started. Prior to Nayib Bukele's presidency, El Salvador was mired in political polarization, whose parties today do not have even 3% of voting intentions. Despite generating several conflicting opinions, Nayib Bukele's government managed to transform El Salvador, a small nation of around 6 million inhabitants characterized by poverty and the presence of gangs such as the Mara Salvatrucha, into a model of a country that many admire. Throughout Latin America, presidents and presidential candidates, such as Ecuador's Daniel Noboa and Guatemala's Sandra Torres, are tempted to impose security models like that of El Salvador, which have ensured Bukele's re-election, according to polls. In addition to insecurity, Bukele's arrival to the presidency also broke with the two-party system that had prevailed in El Salvador since the early 1990s. On February 4th, Nayib Bukele achieved another term in the presidency of El Salvador with 84.6% of the votes, despite his accusations of unconstitutionality. The Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN, is a left-wing political party in El Salvador that barely reached 6.4% of the votes, despite having governed between 2009 and 2019 when it lost against Bukele's party. The FMLN was a party that emerged as a response to the 20-year period governed by the right-wing Nationalist Republican Alliance Party, or ARENA, which barely reached 1% of voting intentions. The FMLN was created on October 10, 1980, as a guerrilla party that participated in the Salvadorian Civil War, whose militants were trained by the government of Fidel Castro in Cuba. Both parties appeared after the Civil War in El Salvador, a period of war that was never officially declared, but is usually considered to have developed between 1979 and 1992, led by guerrillas and the military governments in turn. Broadly speaking, El Salvador had a guerrilla period like most countries in Latin America, with the difference of gangs. This civil war caused a massive migration to the United States by thousands of Salvadorians who settled in dangerous neighborhoods of Los Angeles, where the two main gangs in Central America would be born, Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. Given the rapid growth of these gangs in the United States, the Ronald Reagan government decided to bring mass deportations to El Salvador, which was just beginning to recover from its civil war, which made it easier for them to take power in several regions. Security experts assure that the power of these criminal groups increased due to other problems such as poverty, corruption, and even criminal alliances with Mexican cartels. In 2015 alone, El Salvador recorded 103 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, and the figure has been decreasing at a rate of 2.4 violent deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, according to the Bukele government. Now, if you're finding this video insightful so far, like it. It would mean a whole lot to us. He's only 42 years old, and what he's done in his country is considered almost miraculous. He came to power on June 1st, 2019. That same year, he announced his so-called territorial control plan, implemented a cell phone signal blockade in prisons, and declared a prison emergency. In a second phase, he reinforced the military, and on September 2nd of that year, the first day without homicides in the history of that small country was recorded. From that moment, the good news began to arrive. A month later, the United States revoked the travel alert for its citizens to El Salvador due to the drop in insecurity. Bukele's strategy continued to be strengthened with a juicy salary increase for guards, police, and soldiers, and continued with new incorporations. The pandemic came and managed to consolidate 2020 as the safest year. He inaugurated the Forensic Investigation Center in 2021 and promoted the dismissal of the Attorney General and the judges of the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court of Justice by the Legislative Assembly. Towards August 2021, Bukele promoted a reform so that judges, prosecutors, and police officers could retire at the age 60. El Salvador closed 2021 with the safest year in its entire history. But there was an event that marked the government. Between March 25th and 27th, 2022, the country was shaken by a wave of 87 homicides. At that moment, the president declared war on the gangs. He decreed a state of emergency, added new troops to the forces, and reformed the penal code in the Legislative Assembly, where symbols related to gangs were prohibited, and approved the use of assets seized from them to combat them. In June of that year, he announced the construction of the largest prison in Latin America, the Terrorism Confinement Center, or CCOT, and launched the Safe Transportation Plan. While making massive arrests, on December 3, 2022, he began security fences for the extraction of gang members. At the end of that year, El Salvador once again broke a security record. Only 6 months after announcing it, Bukele made the mega prison a reality and inaugurated it on January 31, 2023. The images of the prison went around the world. In February of that year, he completed 300 days without any homicide in his government and transferred the first 2,000 imprisoned gang members to CCOT. A video that he published on his Twitter account showing the entry of criminals into prison, in packs, generated controversy in some sectors of the continent, but mostly applause, in a region where impunity and the weak hand against the underworld outraged citizens. Those who know Bukele assure that the so-called millennial president is a self-taught man, because, although he began studying law, he did not graduate. He then completed some studies in the United States. The figures of its success are shocking. In 2018, before Bukele was president, El Salvador topped the list of the 20 most dangerous countries in the world, with a homicide rate of 61.59 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. In 2021, with Bukele in power, El Salvador completely left that blacklist. In 2023, the homicide rate per 100,000 inhabitants was only 2.4 cases. Since March 2022, when he went head-to-head against the gangs, to date, Bukele has managed to capture 75,000 terrorists. Such an operation has not involved a bloodbath. They were a power parallel to the institutional power of the state, which was practically on its knees before this power of the criminal groups. The vice president of El Salvador, Felix Ulloa, told Semana, "The heavy hand has had notable results. The impunity rate in homicides went from 95% in 2019 to 25% in 2022, which indicates that committing a crime in that country has a practically guaranteed punishment." Bukele's government team maintains that the president constantly refers to the fact that his limit is God, while his relationship with the traditional parties is almost zero, and he faces minimal opposition. His approval among Salvadorians in terms of security reaches 96%, in education 91%, in health 87%, in employment at 73%, and in cost of living at 63%. Now let's analyze what's been the most recurring criticisms of the Bukele government at the international level. Bukele has been characterized by maintaining a permanent dispute with international human rights organizations, such as the IACHR and even the UN. He sung those institutions and told them to their faces, how many more decades, filled with tens of thousands of deaths, should we Salvadorians have endured so that the recipes of the NGOs and the international community will they start working? Bukele has said that for years, the human rights of criminals have mattered more than those of honest people. He worked hard to completely reverse that equation. Although it had a very good relationship with the United States during the Trump government, with Joe Biden, relations have been cloudy. Although Bukele is pro-United States, since he campaigned, he announced that he wanted El Salvador to be independent, not to receive orders from Washington, and to be autonomous, even economically. Perhaps for this reason, on several occasions, he's distanced himself from the northern country. The United States government decides who is bad and who is good, and also when the bad becomes good and the good becomes bad, Bukele said on Twitter. While some see him as a true messiah, others describe him as a right-wing dictator and accuse him of being a violator of human rights. Salvadorian sources assured Semana that none of these criticisms, for him unfounded, keep him up at night. Vice President Ulloa pointed out, the simplism of some analysts or political opponents speaks of populism, authoritarianism, and they make explanations that do not correspond to reality. This consists of a government that decided to frontally address the main problems that burdened our society, which were insecurity, exploitation, extortion, murder, kidnapping, disappearance, and many other crimes committed by criminal groups. The police were penetrated by these criminal groups. They were poorly equipped. They were police officers who walked around with 3 bullets in their pistol, vehicles that did not work, without protective vests, without means of communication. So one of the tasks was to provide the law enforcement with the necessary equipment, the resources to fight a battle and win it, said Ulloa. Judges who were at the service of gangs were also changed, either because they were bought, because they were bribed, or because they were threatened, added the Vice President of El Salvador. Now I ask you, what do you think of the security policy of Nayib Bukele's government? Let me know in the comment below. And if you like this video, I invite you to subscribe and leave your like for more videos like this one. We'll see you next time.